Welcome to Body Kindness. I'm Rebecca Scritchfield, creator of the Body Kindness Philosophy book and audiobook. I'm here to help you create a better life by reinventing health from the body oppressive, shaming, and you'll never be enough type of mindset to positive and joyful ways that you can spiral up your energy, mood, and your well-being at any size, shape, or weight, and as you are right now. Get started for free at bodykindnessbook.com/start. That's the sound of me smashing a stack of scales in front of some friends. And I have to say that breaking up with the scale and all the other ways I was judging, monitoring, and measuring my worth was absolutely pivotal in my life. Creating the body kindness philosophy and letting myself be a human being again helped me become a better mom, a better clinician, and a happier and healthier person. I believe we all have a right to decide how we want to care for ourselves. And I think we all need support in figuring out what that looks like. You don't have to do this alone. There's a whole community of like-minded people who are fed up with diets, who are embracing intuitive eating, and who are completely redefining their lives from body shame to body kindness. You are not broken. Our culture is. Find your inner caregiver and create a better life with body kindness.
Now, there's nothing wrong with that aspect of yoga, but there is a problem in our culture when other elements of this historical healing practice are stripped away because the asanas are the elements that are going to be most commercially profitable. And it's just like so many other things that originate in communities of color, but then are taken up in a largely white mainstream in the United States. I often think of rap music as another example.
That was Dr. Sabrina Strings. She's an associate professor of sociology at the University of California, Irvine. She was a recipient of the UC Berkeley Chancellor's postdoctoral fellowship with a joint appointment in the School of Public Health and Department of Sociology. She's been featured in the Feminist Wire, Yoga International, LA Yoga, and the New York Times. And her writings can be found in the New York Times, Signs, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, Fat Studies, an interdisciplinary journal of body weight and society, and Feminist Media Studies. Sabrina was the recipient of the 2017 Distinguished Contribution to Scholarship Article Award for Race, Gender, and Class section of the American Sociological Association. Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia is her first book, now available in print, ebook, and audiobook. I'm so honored to be able to bring you this conversation. It's part one in a two-part series exploring yoga. And this all came forward as a result of a Body Kindness reader question that was submitted. And you can read the full question in the show notes. We also read the question in this episode. And I reached out to Dr. Strings because I knew about her work in race and yoga. I knew from our first interview that she had dealt with racism in yoga spaces. And I thought she would be a good person to help me explore the reader question, who was really concerned about how yoga teacher trainings were triggering when they focused on food components, whether that's vegetarian or Ayurveda or, other more diet culture-y presentations. So I hope that this conversation provides some important insight as to what is happening in yoga spaces and has been happening in yoga spaces for far too long with respect to white supremacy and exclusion, weight stigma as well. And then that will be followed by an interview where we discuss solutions. And so what I'm really hopeful for, yoga is personally meaningful to me in my life. And I really feel that in the ways in which it's been co-opted by diet culture is very, very wrong. And I'm not here to say yoga's for everybody or everyone must try yoga. I can only speak from my lived experiences and how yoga has helped me and how I think that there are a lot of problems in the systems and structures that make people struggle with yoga and components of yoga. And so part of this interest is really trying to be present with personal lived experiences and how we can practice body kindness in these situations where we're being excluded and not being thought about, but then to take the level of conversation deeper and explore how to create real systemic change from the inside out. So I really hope you enjoy this series. If you have questions for the podcast, it's bodykindnessbook.com/question. And hopefully it will inspire me to take the show in a direction like this listener questioner has. Thank you and enjoy the show. Hey, Sabrina, welcome back to Body Kindness.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me again.
Well, we were just talking before I hit record that it's basically around our 1-year anniversary. You were on the show when your first book came out, Fearing the Black Body. I've loved that book, recommended to so many people. It's one of my most popular podcasts and will be for a long time, such an important, relevant topic.
And thank you so much for that. I can't believe the book has been out for a year. It's incredible how time flies when you're no longer 5 years old. Time is just zooming by. It's like, what is going on?
I know. It all happens so fast. And every time Body Kindness is another year older, I light a little birthday candle. So in January, Body Kindness will be 4. So you're entering toddler stages and I'm entering whatever's after young child. And congrats on Fearing the Black Body as an audiobook as well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that was very exciting to have Tantor Publishing interested in the book. And so it's now available for those of you who really enjoy listening to audiobooks.
Yes. And you have a real pro who is reading the book. And she's a woman of color, too. Very important to her. She's a Black woman, right?
That was so important. Yeah, she's a Black woman. Because I saw the name Allison and then I noticed the spelling and I was like, let me just double check. So, fortunately, it is a Black woman. I think that's very important.
You know, can I say when I saw your initial share, I was also curious. I know about Tantor. They're one of the top audiobook publishers. And I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. And I was like, ooh, who did they get to read? Only because I can never miss an opportunity for some good spilled tea in the publishing world because they constantly make mistakes. So I was super excited to see that they did not screw that up for you.
I was as well. I have to admit, I didn't have any say in who they chose, but I was really pleased to see that they chose such an accomplished journalist even.
Yeah.
So I was very pleased with their choice.
Yeah, me too. Anyway, a major pivot back to the topic for today. We are going to discuss yoga and the good, bad, and ugly, so to speak. This episode was inspired by our listener question. So a Body Kindness listener who would really love to fall back in love with yoga again and also be careful to protect themselves. But before I read the question, I'd love for you to share more about yourself and your yoga journey. I know that there's both personal and professional experiences you have with yoga. So what would you like to share with our Body Kindness listeners?
I think it's valuable to consider how I came to yoga in the first place. Mm-hmm. I started doing yoga in the summer of 2010. It just so happens that I was on fellowship and I had the opportunity to live in Berkeley, although at the time I was enrolled in graduate school in Southern California. So I was in Berkeley, house sitting in this gorgeous home that this professor owns. Who knows what emboldened him to actually allow me to stay there and house sit. But it was just so beautiful every day to walk down from the El Cerrito Hills and head to the BART station and can start my day on the Berkeley campus. But in addition to that, I started to feel like I wanted to have other types of, I want to say like physical, I'm even going to use the word exercise experiences, because at that time I didn't know what yoga truly was. And I just so happened to be walking around in downtown Berkeley, saw a yoga studio and thought I might just go in and take a class. And it was really such an incredible experience for me. I thought, oh, this is what yoga is. I thought it was just something that, slender white women were doing to get their abs in shape. Mm-hmm. But it was actually so much more than that. It was an opportunity for us to sit first in meditation. Sometimes there would be chanting. There might even be what might be deemed like a minor Dharma talk in which people were talking about the relationship between yoga and spirituality before we got into the poses. There was relaxation. There was just this integration of many different elements of various forms of healing that I needed in my life at that time, because graduate school is a nightmare for anyone who's ever been in it or thought about doing it. It's worthwhile for many of us, but nevertheless, it is extraordinarily challenging. So I had this beautiful experience of living in this gorgeous place and doing yoga and having it be like very much about the body and about spirituality. And I was able to take that practice with me back when I went back to Southern California to graduate school the following term. And it really helped me to find ease amid the challenges that I was facing. I mean, it's like, I can definitely tell you more about what those challenges were and how they also appeared in the yoga studio. But suffice it to say that when you are a Black woman who is in a graduate program, and most graduate programs are largely white, you are feeling alienated, you're feeling sad, you're looking for refuge. And yoga provided that for me at that time.
That's so beautiful. It makes me think about my relationship to yoga. And I literally grabbed a piece of paper and wrote down, yoga saved me twice. Right?
Yeah.
The first was related to, what we call body image, right? Really is my relationship with myself, my true inner self. And so there was a lot of just mind stuff that really helped me reframe, but ultimately want to connect to myself without judgment. And it really, I did feel like it was a saving grace. And the second time was really just recently. And it was probably kind of like a year or so of a downward spiral that I didn't really want to admit to, because it was like, no, this is just every entrepreneur or parent is never going to have enough time and do enough, right? Like this happens to all of us. And literally my body broke out into 5 different rashes. And it was really weird. The doctor's like, this is anxiety. And she's holding my phone saying these things kill people. And I was like scratching my rashes, taking my prescription for prednisone and my referral for a dermatologist. And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And it was literally after the meds and 6 more months later, where finally, I'm looking at my husband and I was like, what happens when the helper needs help? And I'm crying and saying, I don't think this is depression, but I think the helper needs help. And I could feel, the anxiety in my body, and then literally the rashes. And it's still, I don't know why it was so hard to accept. But eventually I asked my husband, can I go to this yoga retreat in Costa Rica? And it was, that week between Christmas and New Year. And I just had this vision of like really appreciating and holding close the elements of yoga that are providing a benefit. So anyway, that's long-winded story, but yoga definitely saved me twice.
Yeah. And, it has that capacity for you. So much of what you were seeking was that ease, just like a place where you could just feel at ease, which is very important in our culture. And I think for me, obviously the ease was important, but it was the mixture of being challenged and being held that made yoga powerful for me. In my normal life as a graduate student, I was challenged constantly intellectually, but I also felt discarded in many respects. I had a fantastic committee that was supportive of me then and is supportive of me now. But outside of them, the space of graduate school felt cold. It felt alienating, and it also felt unwelcoming to someone like me. So their being challenged meant something different from the sense of being challenged that I had in the yoga studio, where it was many times, especially once I started to go through my teacher training, I knew and loved many of the people in the room. I know that they felt similarly about me, and they were concerned for my well-being, and hence us coming together and practicing in that way. So there's the capacity for yoga to do that. But unfortunately, as many people have talked about, and also something that I've been talking about and publishing about for some time, yoga is in the United States is getting so far away from those historical roots of allowing people to find challenge, ease, refuge in other spaces with people who are performing the practice. It's become so much a form of exhibitionism. It's become so much about modifying the body in ways that can meet mainstream standards, largely of femininity, that people go there And now a space that should be welcoming, should be calming and soothing, is yet another space where you're confronted with various forms of oppression that exist in outside society.
And it's sad and disappointing and frankly unacceptable that, it's like we're kind of ruining it, right? I know that there's a commercialization aspect in which yoga is getting ruined, but how would you like to help us kind of unpack this a little bit further, that yoga today is just different than it used to be? Elitism, racism, diet culture, like what's the mechanism, that is kind of erasing the inclusive and the best aspects and benefits of yoga?
Yeah. When we talk about yoga in the West, what people normally mean are the asanas or the poses. But people are often unaware of the fact that historically, when yoga was practiced, and yoga's been around by some estimations for more than 2,500 years, it was really a form of meditative and spiritual practice. There were asanas involved, but the asanas were used as a gateway to allow people to sit for a longer period of time in meditation. When we think about the holistic system of yoga, people commonly think of it as containing three elements. That is the meditation, the asanas, and the breath work. But in contemporary society, it's so common for the meditation aspect to be minimized, for the breath work to be completely gone, and for everything to be focused on poses that are going to ignite a fire in your muscles. Now, there's nothing wrong with that aspect of yoga, but there is a problem in our culture when other elements of this historical healing practice are stripped away because the asanas are the elements that are going to be most commercially profitable. And it's just like so many other things that originate in communities of color, but then are taken up in a largely white mainstream in the United States. I often think of rap music as another example. Rap music started out in the underground. It was very much about challenging racism. It was very much about liberation. There's various documentaries that can, one of them being The Rebel Kings, which is really phenomenal, that point to the origins of hip hop music and how it sprung up in relationship to the civil rights movement, which so few people know. And similarly, yoga sprung up as a form of liberation theology, as a form of spiritual path. And yet the way it's taken up, it has been co-opted to incorporate and really prioritize many of the more white supremacists, many of the more sort of racist, sexist, and sometimes homophobic elements that exist in our culture. And that's really the tragedy. Such that when I started practicing yoga in Southern California after I left the Bay Area, I remember coming into a studio and setting my mat down. And the white woman whose mat was next to mine, picked up her mat and moved it to the far end of the room. And then she turned back and started to explain herself. I suppose mostly for her own good, because I already knew why she moved her mat. But it's that kind of experience that I was having. It was like, oh, this beautiful, healing, wonderful modality that I just happened upon as I was walking through downtown Berkeley. When I was in San Diego practicing yoga, was completely transformed into yet another space where I might feel alienated on the basis of my identity.
That's traumatic if you think about it,
Yeah, it could have been. Fortunately for me, that was not my introduction to yoga.
Yeah.
And I meet people all the time for whom those kinds of incidents are the introduction to yoga. Like I remember when I started telling my mom that I did yoga, she was like, isn't that for skinny white girls? And I'd be like, no, that's not what yoga is about, but that's the mainstream perception. And when I started offering yoga in places like Irvine, which is where I currently reside, I would have other Black women say things to me like, I can't do downward dog. And I'd be like, but yoga is more than downward dog. You can never do downward dog and you could still be doing yoga.
Yeah. And I think it is wrapped up in like what we do in America and who we do things for. And it is always for the most privileged. And that's going to be race privilege, economic privilege. And, like because there's an asana element of yoga, then it can be co-opted by diet culture, which means it's the the beauty thin ideal, so then it's
Mhm.
also a woman's workout because it's the woman's burden. And it gets real messy. I remember talking to you, and I think it was your study, but it like the lightening of the skin on the cover of yoga journals or like magazines, like even who we
Oh,
present is thinner and lighter skinned.
yeah. So that was something I did as part of a study
Mm-hmm.
that came out last year with a couple of colleagues, in which we wanted to just sort of see how Yoga Journal transformed between 1975, when it started, and 2015, so 40 years. We looked at articles in Yoga Journal and the way in which they describe beauty. And beauty can mean many different things. It doesn't have to just be about feminine attractiveness.
Mm-hmm.
So how do they describe beauty, just as a term? How do they represent yoga practitioners on the cover? And what we found was such a dramatic paring down in all the ways of what constitutes yoga. Like in the early days of yoga, in the 1970s, and then even through the 80s, you might find Indian gurus. You might find groups of people sitting in a circle holding hands. You might find sort of a couple in an embrace. Like there were all of these different things that constituted yoga. And there are all of these different people who were represented as either yoga practitioners or as gurus. However, by the late 90s, early 2000s, when Yoga Journal as a magazine was sold to Citicorp,
Mm.
you can imagine what happened then, right? Like now, all of a sudden, the covers are featuring usually slender and young white women in a contorted posture,
Mm-hmm.
right? So not sitting in meditation, but in some type of backbend often.
Mm-hmm.
So hyper sexualized, they're all usually in spandex, very much focused on the body, very much focused on what might be deemed like a certain form of acrobatic posture. And so we can understand how once yoga exploded in the mainstream consciousness, which coincided with this sell of Yoga Journal to Citicorp, how this became the public image of the practice.
Mm-hmm.
When in reality, the practice doesn't necessarily have anything to do with that. It's simply the way in which it's been commercialized to make money. Because, of course, women are still being constantly told that the way in which they can find worth in this world is by transforming their body to look a particular way. And then what happened? In the late 90s, Yoga Journal said, but we have something for you. Like we have a tool to help you figure out how to meet the standards of your own oppression. Ta-da!
Wow. And it's like, it's interesting, right? Because it's like we started this conversation talking about ways in which, our lives are forever changed because of yoga, right? So we're the lucky ones to have a certain type of an experience that allowed us to see the benefits despite cultural norms. And maybe that has to do with, like, for me, right, having race privilege and size privilege and, the ability to be able to go to yoga class in DC. So there's an economic privilege too, right? Like maybe that I was already shielded from some oppressions that allowed me to experience. So it was that plus, oh, I'm walking right out of here, just
Oh, yeah.
wrong teacher
Mm-hmm.
said the wrong thing, put weights in my hands, cranked up the heat.
Oh my God.
Like, what is this?
That whole thing.
This is
And
like
it's
a
like, I'm
torture
not
chamber.
to choose that, but that's not for me.
Yeah.
But exactly. I think I just was so fortunate to come upon yoga at a time period in which the practice that I've just described was even still available, widely available, especially in the Bay Area. I did my yoga teacher training in 2013. So 3 years after I initially was exposed to yoga as a practice. And I did it at a Piedmont yoga, which no longer exists in the same form. And I had the opportunity to train with Richard Rosen, who was one of my primary teachers and who was one of the founders of Yoga Journal. And I remember even asking him, like, why are there so many white women in yoga? Why is Yoga Journal like so obsessed with presenting us with the same images again and again and again of white women who look like models doing yoga? And he was like, I don't know. And I thought that was because here's a man who's one of the founders of the journal, and even he could not really get some type of handle on what could explain this transformation. Hence my deciding to do research into it and finding out that Citigroup was behind that. But nevertheless, I think that the yoga studio where I did my training closed effectively and was sort of purchased by some other folks, and the name was changed.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say it was something like 2016, maybe a little bit later than that, but around about 2015 to 2017, they closed. And I thought the experience that I had of being able to train with these people who had been doing yoga for decades and were committed to yoga as a practice of sort of like a therapy, in fact, a space where you got to find other people who were like you, who were simply trying to figure out healthy ways to live in the world. Like that aspect of it, I think is so difficult to come by, and especially in some spaces. Like I'm not sure quite where you'd find it in Southern California. And so I wonder for people who are interested in yoga today, where they can go and where they can find those types of more spiritual, more holistic approaches to yoga. Because for the most part, I have stopped going to studios. I stopped going to yoga studios about 2 years ago because of the fact that I was having some really problematic experiences in those spaces. It was one thing to go to a yoga studio in 2011 or whatever that was and have that white woman move her mat to the other side of the room because I realized that that was a function of her. Versus when I go into a studio and, the 22-year-old who was teaching the course is giving us no meditation, no breath work, very little shavasana. It's all about, all right, today we're going to master handstands. It's like, sure, you can do a handstand in yoga. That's great. But why is that the entire practice again? I thought that we were going to be here sort of recognizing our individual and collective power. But it's so much more about generating a sweat than other things in many spaces.
And it's like that cycle, right? Because studios stay open when they're full, and they're going to be full when people are there to get what they think they want, which is, if it's the diet culture thing, then it's the handstand sweat session with no opening meditation or savasana at the end, So
yeah,
it's very cyclical in that regard. So
and actually, I wanted to just return briefly to something that you said about sort of like having thin privilege in the space, because it turns up in a really peculiar way for me as a slender Black woman, because people see me and at first they're confused because there's a Black woman coming in the room. But then, once they take me in a sort of like a larger fashion, they're like, oh, well, this is a person with a figure that I associate with yoga. And so sometimes this is one of the curious things that happened to me doing yoga over the years, which was that sometimes people would come up to me and say things to me like, what kind of poses do you do to get your ROMs like that? Like, how do I build up my delts? I don't know. That's not what yoga is for. So I'd be like, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. Where do you get your Michelle Obamas? This kind of thing. My response was always like, this is just the way that I look. So I can't tell you how to look like me any more than you can tell me how to look like you. Like, these are not things that we can do as human beings. And the other thing that I've confronted frequently was people making statements about obesity in the yoga space that were extremely fat phobic and harmful. And one time, as I was in my yoga teacher training, I had like just a full out argument with one of the teachers who was relating this story of one of her regular students bringing her husband to a retreat. And her husband, this is the woman, describing this man. Oh, and the husband was obese and he couldn't do the poses. And it was just so hard on her trying to have this. And I was just like, weight is not a determining factor in health. And it's not a determining factor in the physical ability to do the pose. Like, it's like we see so many amazing people of different sizes doing yoga all the time. And like, for me to have to express that to a woman who had been doing yoga and teaching yoga for 15 years was really demoralizing. But it was a bellwether of what was ultimately to come in the next few years in yoga.
Yeah. I mean, I've had so many clients, you try to sell them on the benefits of yoga for emotion regulation and stress and anxiety and healing connection and all these positive things. And then just you've already hear horror stories of past experiences and leaving a room crying and like, and all the safety measures that they would do. Like, I have to be there early, talk to the teacher, have a mat right by the door in case, it gets too overwhelming emotionally for me and I need to leave. And it just all that emotional effort just to be able to be in a space that is supposed to be about connection and community and healing. It really is, it's an injustice. It's a major injustice. And
yeah, I'm just saying, I was just going to say that it's the emotional effort and also the intense focus on the body, on like shaping the body in a particular fashion. That's extremely harmful. We don't need to be in a yoga studio to think about shaping our bodies in a particular fashion. We could go literally anywhere in the United States and have that be a focus. And the idea is that yoga can be a space where we can release all of that, where we can understand the value, the inherent value of our bodies and all the things that our bodies do for us without trying to transform them in a particular way. So that is yet another thing that I think is frequently lost in mainstream yoga spaces.
Yeah. And also the aversion to props. It's like, what's wrong with blocks and straps? Use them.
Right. Like, and I have to admit, like, even me, like, there have been times when I've been in a class and I'm just like, oh, I don't want to have to go to the prop wall and I'll just, do the, and then if it's a good teacher, which I've been fortunate enough to have many, they'll come over and they'll hand me the prop and they'll show me the ways in which I'm doing the pose correctly. It's just like, it's a reminder that for all of us, our egos can get in the way of what we're there to actually do. So it's just, the props are there for our benefit. There's nothing wrong with using them.
I remember the first time I did a Savasana with a bolster under my knees and I was like, oh, this is nice. And I fell asleep. Bolsters, blankets, all the props are really good.
Yeah. It's just like even doing more relaxing, like therapeutic yoga practices, ones that aren't so sort of energetic, right? The restorative yoga practices, the yin yoga practices. Yeah. Like the first couple of times I did those, I thought, this is phenomenal. Here I've been doing all this Ashtanga, but what I probably really needed more of was just to lay on top of the bolsters.
Yeah. And I think being open to a variety of experiences and trying to find places that offer, the best fit or just like the best fit for you and reframing what you're trying to get out of yoga or a couple, kind of tips and examples that we can give to people. But I do want to pivot to the listener question. And I'm so glad you've been through teacher training because it's about someone who was going through a teacher training. And prescriptive eating that was part of the curriculum. And so you might have some experience with this. Real quick, though, before I read the question, did you do teacher training, just personal interest, take my practice deeper? Or were you planning to teach and what's that story?
It was both things, actually. I definitely wanted to deepen my practice. And when I first came to the teacher training and I was talking to sort of the people at the open house about what I wanted, I was also still nevertheless sort of steeped in the idea of like the relationship between yoga and asanas. And so I was like, I'm really working on my scorpion pose. Like to think that would have been a goal is so funny in hindsight, because I got so much more out of yoga than that. So in the beginning I was like, I'll deepen my practice. But then what I ended up getting from the training was so much more valuable, like getting exposure to the history of the practice, being able to understand the absolute importance of the breath work. And incorporating the breath work into pretty much any yoga class that I ever taught. Deciding that I wanted to offer free yoga classes as a form of therapy in communities that don't often have access to yoga because, well, it's largely aggregated in middle class and wealthier communities. So it started out as a personal journey, but then it became something that I wanted to incorporate into just the way that I move through the world and the way that I interact with people.
That's beautiful. I remember I went to a media event in Tulsa and it was focused on social justice and how Tulsa was trying to rebuild and repair from the Tulsa race massacre. And it was interesting to attend and participate. But one of the things, we went to a program that was essentially for women who were incarcerated on like drug charges and other, I don't know, how do you say lower, kind of potential for rehabilitation, who had kids. And anyway, you could really see the benefits of yoga in a therapeutic sense was part of what helped them feel like, human again, and that they could have a better life and a better future. And the person who led all of that had also gone through a teacher training, because essentially, just for listener benefits, like if you want to be a teacher, you have to go through a teacher training, and teacher trainings are, you probably know way more than me, but there's a governing body that says, yes, you can be a teacher training organization if you meet certain criteria, and there's certain levels. And I'm sure you have to pay the governing body, but then the people who want to get certified pay you. And there's a whole business model around. Is that basically how it works?
That sounds about right. Yeah.
Okay. So the listener question is someone who was going through a teacher training, and she's taken several. So she says, I've taken several yoga teacher trainings, all the trainings. So she says, all the trainings have talked about the right foods to eat. In my mind, I'm sure in many others that it's just a small step away from saying, if I eat this way, then I'll become a better yogi, a slimmer yogi, a more worthy and better person. It's my opinion that the teaching food choices needs to stop in yoga teacher trainings. My last yoga training taught us to eat vegetarian and raw. I spiraled down during that training. I actually had gone through 3 different yoga teacher trainings, all suggesting a certain type of diet. Yoga probably attracts lots of people with disordered eating. So why is this acceptable in Yoga Alliance? I would love to fall back in love with yoga again, and also be careful to protect myself.
This is such a really tricky question, because I absolutely understand where the person who wrote this letter is coming from, which is that I have also been, as I mentioned, in fat phobic yoga spaces. However, I think we also have to keep in mind that even if diet culture does creep into yoga, and one of my colleagues, Jennifer Musial, has written about this, about what's considered orthorexia in yoga studio spaces, which is like you're in yoga and they're trying to get you to eat in a particular way that is coded as healthy, but is really just a form of trying to limit what you can intake as a form of limiting your body size, right? So, I mean, I think that essay that she wrote is really worth checking out.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
So even though
show notes.
Yeah. So even if that is going on, that's not the only or even the original reason why people are talking about food choices in yoga spaces. So I haven't ever done a training where they've told us what to eat. However, I do know of people who are practitioners of Ayurveda, and they do provide some ideas of the kinds of foods that people can eat for various reasons. The good ones, evidently, are not going to give people advice on what to eat to lose weight, because it's not intended to be a diet in that way. It's supposed to be a way for you to determine what kind of energy you have circulating in your body. Are you a water type? So do you have like the kapha energy, in which you're maybe a little bit slower, easier, right? And so maybe you want to eat foods that boost your energy. Maybe you're like a pitta type, which is like me, full of fire. And then for people who have like these fiery energies, perhaps we want to eat in ways that might be soothing or calming, or, sort of like don't ignite that kind of energy all the time. So there is a theory behind Ayurveda. And, I'm not the most well-versed in its practice, but I know that there are people who are capable of presenting it in a savvy way that is not about weight loss. So let me ask. So,
in being in a teacher training, before you sign up, you could probably look at what's being offered, and maybe, I don't know if this is a correct assumption, but it's like almost all yoga teacher trainings might at least mention something on Ayurveda or yoga and food from a historical context, so to speak.
Again, that wasn't my experience necessarily, but there are so many different trainings that are available that, so what I experienced at Piedmont Yoga is going to be very different from what someone experiences at somewhere like Core Power,
right?
Which is going to be, I'm thinking, largely asana focused. But it would be possible to find teacher trainings where they don't talk about Ayurveda at all. It would be possible to find ones where they're doing it in a way that is actually closer connected to its historical meanings. So that's the difficulty with it being yoga that is being commercialized and ubiquitous, which is that the quality of what you receive is going to vary widely. And so you really have to be discerning in your choice.
Mm-hmm. Well, and here's an interesting thought, right? Because I'm looking at this and I'm just like, okay, so as somebody who's offering the teacher training, how about you be weight inclusive and health at every size? Like
Exactly.
put that into your structure and your curriculum and put in there that, these are the values of this training and, to be inclusive. And if you feel that there is going to be education around food and yoga, right? Making sure that it's maintaining the historical roots for education and information. And someone who's going through the certification can check through the material and check that box, and then doesn't have to ever incorporate that again if that's not a fit for you. But you can make that distinction, right? Like you can make that change as the certifying body. But if you yourself are not woke to the problems with fat phobia, you're probably not even thinking along those lines.
Exactly. And because of the fact that we're living in a culture which is waking up to the reality of fat stigma and how harmful it is. And there are so many studies that show that fat stigma is far more harmful than simply being fat. But even if that is going on, simultaneously, we still have the drumbeat of obesity in our country, really in the Western world, in which just like we need to be worried about getting people to lose weight. We need to be worried about obesity. It's like obesity science hasn't gone anywhere. And so we are confronted with this conflicting reality in which, okay, we know that fat stigma is a serious problem. And yet we're also in an environment in which even high-profile medical authorities are still telling people to lose weight. It's outmoded. It doesn't work. It's harmful, but they're still promoting that message. And so I think if you are, for example, working with Yoga Alliance and you are seeing that there's a training in which they are suggesting various diets for weight control, you might be, if you are invested in traditional obesity science, of the opinion that this is helpful, even when it is not. So that's the difficulty. We're not given one clean message about how to approach people with compassion, because some people think that telling people to lose weight is a compassionate response, though it is obviously not.
Yeah, it's like they don't, they're not aware of the potential for harm based on where we currently are at, right? The awakening is still happening. That's what's so frustrating, is that we can't control how rapid the awakening happens, right? So then we're relegated to be an individual who's interested in teacher training, who has the power of choice to choose the best fit training for me, but has to do all this extra labor just to try to figure and find that out. And again, back to let me look at the curriculum, let me have a conversation, let me say what I need and don't need out of a curriculum. Is there a way, if there's, something that looks like is going to be problematic in the education standpoint, how do I complete that module without causing a lot of self-harm? Because, that's the thing, like what I saw in the question is that there's also some internal, like, healing, I think, in this listener's dilemma. For me, in all honesty, I've just gotten so good at protecting myself from whatever I perceive as a potential threat. Somebody somewhere is still going to hurt you in that experience, right? Like, I hate to say that, but that's probably likely to be true, because we can't control other people's thoughts, feelings, or actions. And we're all in this toxic system together. And so maybe it's, I don't disagree. Well, I don't know if I agree or disagree. Like, she literally said, I think Yoga Alliance to just eliminate food and certification. Well, maybe it's not eliminate, but maybe it's like have more guidance around the structure of what is okay and not okay. Because to your point, maybe some of these trainings are saying, hey, let's recommend whatever plan that's not even Ayurveda, but just like, we're going to recommend this plan because that's what's going to make our training special, or because they're going to sell more seats if it's keto, vegetarian, something or other, but it's at some point you got to get through, you got to try to find your best fit and learn to survive in a culture that really sucks.
There is that. And, I think one thing to keep in mind is that there are a lot of contemplative practices and even sects of Christianity. So not just in Eastern religions and forms of spirituality in which like questions surrounding diet appear. So I would say that you don't want to claim that this should be removed entirely, because for some people, taking up various eating practices is part of their spiritual practice. And so it's completely understandable. I mean, whenever you do a Buddhist meditation retreat, for example, and I've done several of those, and I find them to be extremely valuable. The ones that I've done have been vegetarian based. And so, before and after, I get my fill of foods that I'm not going to have there. But part of the spiritual practice there is to try to eat plant-based to reduce harm that might come to animals. So, I mean, we can understand that.
Yeah.
So we can understand that various paths have different routines. But the question is about the harm that's being caused. And I think that's absolutely a valid question for the person who wrote in. And I think that what you were mentioning about this whole idea of having to face these challenges that can be triggering and harmful is so important, because this is really what yoga is about. You want to find that you are in a space where you feel like people are like-minded and that you feel comfortable. But let's face the reality that spaces are rarely safe. It's usually people who are already comfortable in our broader society who are going to feel comfortable in yoga studio spaces, right? So it's like a space where the comfortable are further comforted. So if you are a kind of person who has dealt with various difficulties in your life, if you are from an identity group that is known to be marginalized or oppressed, those things are still going to show up. But if you keep doing the practice in a space where you feel like you can at least find your people, even if it's not perfect, if you can keep doing the practice, you will find that yoga provides you with the tools that you need to meet these forms of oppression in the studio and also in life in general. One of the stories that I have is that when I was in graduate school, there was a woman, a white woman and a professor who I was telling, oh my gosh, like I don't see myself represented here. Everything on this campus feels so white. I don't feel like I belong. I'm trying to express my need for connection and my need to feel a sense of belonging. And her response to me was, you know what? Graduate school is a white space, and some very, 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 very smart people don't make it.
Whoa.
So, yeah. And
wow.
That kind of experience was so devastating in the moment. To go to someone seeking some type of help and assistance, and instead to be given dismissal was so difficult. But it was yoga that ultimately helped me to recover from those forms of violence that were taking place in my life, not just in graduate school, but in other forms of violence that I was experiencing. So it's a difficult thing to navigate, because yoga is commercialized. You can find that it can be equally problematic as anything else in America. But there are those spaces that still exist. Maybe they're becoming fewer and farther between, where you can start to feel your whole self, and where you can start to just find joy and appreciation for even those aspects of life that you used to really resent, including the form of your physical body.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because I feel that a lot of, like when a part of me gets really irritated with the shortcomings of our culture and the fact that I can't do anything, just immediately change it, make it work the way I want it to work. That it requires a lot of compassion, acceptance of what is, compassion for that part of me that's so, so, so incredibly frustrated. And there's this aspect of like permission to get what I need out of it, even with my frustrations with the system as it is, right? So that every part of me has a voice, right? This part that's really frustrated and oh, this sucks so bad, and start to get feelings of, well, maybe I shouldn't participate at all. And there's like, but then I wouldn't have the benefits of this. You feel like this tug of war in your mind about, you might decide, well, yoga isn't a safe space. So then there's an avoidance. And then by making that choice, in some ways, it's a form of trying to protect yourself, but then it's also a form of missing out because you can't get access to the benefits that could be of yoga. And, and that's kind of my sadness and the loss of is I would hate for listeners to just give up on trying and finding what could work and fit for them. Because it could be, you might be missing out on things that could really help you heal personally and feel, calm and connected and more grounded and thusly better be able to participate in other meaningful things of your life, like your relationships and your work, and just generally feel happier and better at riding the waves of what it means to be a human these days. And like, I personally believe that yoga has that type of potential. But when you're, swimming in those waters, you're going to encounter a lot of unhelpful, not for me, yuck, and how to give yourself permission to just still be there, but, sort through what is and isn't for you, but keep trying anyway, because you're worth it, and be open to those positive, beneficial experiences. Because that's what, and when we started talking, we each had a story, something early in our yoga experiences was so uniquely beneficial that was the motivation and the connection that we needed to keep exploring.
Yes. And I think that there's no perfect place. I think what you were talking about, like this whole question of protecting ourselves, ironically, the more we try to close in, close off, push away. And this is something that we can also get through contemplative practices like yoga, which is the awareness that this kind of like folding in on ourselves that we tend to do when something is uncomfortable is actually counterproductive. What we need to do is to figure out how we can make ourselves more resilient, how we can manage to nevertheless try to be vulnerable and open to new experiences and new people, even though we know that the world can be a harmful place. So through the practice, we can build up that resilience. And if we're fortunate, we can even find that community, but it's never going to be perfect. I know people in the yoga community who have been Me Too'd. I know people in the yoga community that, have done some things that I would never feel comfortable with, and I'm no longer in contact with them. So it's not as if it's going to be a space where you've met these elevated beings. You're still going to be meeting humans. You're still going to be a human, but you're going to find the ability within yourself to face challenges that you used to shirk from. And you'll realize that they're actually not that terrifying in many instances as you would have thought in the beginning.
I love that. I love the idea of you'll find that it's not that terrifying as you anticipated. And I also picked up on how you mentioned that there were some really problematic people and you just, decided to end contact. And because I do think, an important way to close out is to empower people on the benefit of boundaries. And one is just, I'm never talking to you again. Others might, right. Hey, you did this and it bothered me, or I have, I know you to be a very caring person about well-being, and I have some information to share about something you said in the class. And those conversations are hard and awkward, and it's not your personal life's burden to do every single one of them. But if you find a person that you care enough about, whether it's generally you like their class or generally you like their training, or just you feel like you have the bandwidth to say something, I think being brave to say something, focus on the behavior, that helps to reduce the shame, the shame and blame of you suck so bad. And like, let one part of you say that in your mind, but what comes out of your mouth is, I know you to be a caring person and I have some feedback for you, and here it is. And you, not that you have to always be the person who always gives the feedback, because that's exhausting. And it's like, trying to save a sinking ship with a teaspoon or something. But when you have the energy, it can feel very empowering to just take a meaningful action and do your part for change.
Yeah. It's like every scenario doesn't require the same tool. Sometimes it is necessary to let people go. Like as I was talking to you about this person who was Me Too'd in our community, it was like, okay, well, this is a person we can no longer work with. However, there are those other individuals who are not engaged in this level of violence, but they're simply suffering. You know, there's this phenomenal yoga teacher, Leslie Booker. I absolutely love her. And she tells the story of being on a subway in New York, and there were a couple of rowdy teenagers who were near her, making noise, upsetting the largely, older population in the vicinity. And she just, said to them, I'm not trying to call you out. I'm trying to call you up. We on this train would like for you to be respectful of other people's space. And it was so kind and loving and there with them that they actually stopped.
Wow.
Yes. But that was the tool that was needed at that time, not to yell at them, not to tell them that they're horrible, because as a couple of, brown kids, I'm sure they hear that all the time. What they needed was for someone to see them. And she did that, and it really changed the dynamic of that space. And so it's if you can stay with the practice, it can give you the tools that you can need to figure out what is actually needed in this time. Sometimes stepping away is what's needed, but sometimes stepping in is what's needed.
That's so powerful. And although we could spend a whole podcast episode just on this topic, I did want to highlight that when it comes to the bigger picture system and structure change, I know one of the things that I've learned is that we need more marginalized people in positions of power, because they'll be able to make those decisions, like diversity on magazine covers and, guidelines and teacher trainings and things like that. So any sort of parting thoughts for that?
I just want to say real diversity, not just brown faces in high places, which is unfortunately the way diversity often is taken up. We don't just need a variety of different hues doing the same things. We need people with different ideas coming from different backgrounds, bringing their inherited knowledge, their cultural knowledge, their life experience to bear on the contemporary moment, such that we might move to a space that is actually an improvement for the vast majority of the population than the space that we're living in right now.
That's so beautiful. Thank you so much for coming and talking to me today.
Thank you. This has been a lot of fun.
All right. One day we're going to meet in person, right? And post-COVID, right? And do some yoga together.
I would love that. Oh my gosh. Yes. Let's do it.
Okay. That would be so lovely. Where can people find and follow you and get all your good stuff besides the book, Fearing the Black Body? That's everywhere, book and audiobook. How else can people be on top of your wonderful insights and teachings?
People can follow me on Twitter at SA Strings. You can also find me on my website, sabrinastrings.com. And the moment that people are able to go outside again, I'm going to be listing my tour dates. So stay tuned for that.
That'll be fabulous. Thank you so much for chatting with me again.
Thank you.
And that's our show. The podcast is made possible with support from listeners. Please donate to help offset production costs at gofundme.com/bodykindness. And please rate and review the show when you have a moment. It really matters. Let's keep the conversations going on Facebook. Search Body Kindness and request to join the group for Body Kindness readers and listeners. Have a question for us to answer on a future episode? Visit bodykindnessbook.com/question. Body Kindness books and audiobooks are available wherever books are sold. To request a signed print copy, visit bodykindnessbook.com/order. For other questions about this podcast, please email info@bodykindnessbook.com.